to Greg Watson, who's our keynote. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Greg over the last, I think, 2 years, a year and a half. And I'm really glad to have you here tonight. I'm going to read your bio. Greg Watson is the Director of Policy and Systems Design at the Schumacher Center for New Economics. His work currently focuses on community food systems and an initiative to improve global systems literacy. Greg has spent over 40 years learning to understand systems thinking as inspired by Buckminster Fuller and to apply that understanding to achieve a just and sustainable world. In 1978, he organized a network of urban farmers markets in the greater Boston metropolitan area. He served as the 19th Commissioner of Agriculture in Massachusetts under Governors Michael Dukakis and William Weld from 1990 to 1993, and under Governor Deval Patrick from 2012 to 2014. During the Patrick administration, he launched a statewide urban agricultural grant program and chaired the Commonwealth's Public Market Commission, which oversaw
Gwendolyn, I think you got muted.
Uh-oh, I don't know the last thing you heard. Did you hear Governor Patrick? During the Patrick administration, he launched a statewide urban agricultural grants program and chaired the Commonwealth's Public Market Commission, which oversaw the planning and construction of the Boston Public Market. From 1984 to 1990, Watson served as Assistant Secretary in the Mass Executive Office of Economic Affairs, where he established and chaired the Mass Office of Science and Technology. In 1988, he presented a paper entitled Preparing Policymakers to Address the Problem of Climate Change at the Second North American Conference on Preparing for Climate Change in Washington, D.C. Greg was featured in Leonardo DiCaprio's 2007 documentary, The 11th Hour. I want to thank you for being with us. And I'm just so excited about your talk. I just want to say the title one more time, Radical Civics and Civil Anarchy. So thank you so much. And I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Gwendolyn, for everything that you do and for inviting me to speak this evening. I'm also going to emphasize the new pathways for transformation and healing in the talk. In 1995, officials at the Yellowstone National Park reintroduced 8 wolves into the environment to help manage an exploding deer population. They were the first wolves to roam the park since 1920. The deer had taken advantage of the absence of the predators and had the run of the park for 70 years, overgrazing and denuding much of it. Human attempts to manage the deer failed, and so the decision was finally made to return wolves to the ailing park. By the end of 1996, 31 wolves were eventually introduced. The impact was almost immediate. The wolves not only killed deer, they changed the deer's behavior. You see, the deer avoided certain parts of the park where they could be trapped by wolves, especially valleys and gorges. These places started to regenerate. Tree heights increased 5-fold within 6 years. Bare valleys spawned aspen, willow, and cottonwood forests. Songbirds returned. So did beavers to feed on the trees, and in return, they created niches for other species. Beaver river dams provided habitat for otters, muskrats, fish, reptiles, ducks, and amphibians. Wolves preyed on coyotes as well as deer, encouraging the reintroduction of rabbits, mice, weasels, and badgers. Ravens, eagles, and bears. I almost said, oh my, but flourished. Incredibly, the impact of the wolves also changed the behavior of the rivers. Regenerated forests stabilized riverbanks and abated soil erosion. In the end, this relatively small intervention dramatically changed both the ecosystem and the physical geography of the park. Science calls this phenomenon a trophic cascade. The point here is the park was transformed and healed. And I want you to keep in mind a concept called trim tabs as we move forward. The transformative process was neither destructive nor disruptive. In the end, it resulted in the restoration of critical elements and relationships, resulting in synergetic systemic integrity. How is this relevant to the goals of this conference, New Pathways for Transformation and Healing? Are there lessons that may be applicable for our current human condition? Well, that's the question. Transformation is defined as a thorough or dramatic change in form or appearance, a metamorphosis. Systems transform in response to external or internal forces that might otherwise lead to collapse. Humans may consciously attempt to transform their systems in anticipation of impending inevitable forces of change. It seems pretty clear to me that two processes of global transformation are already underway. These transformations are a response in part to a need for healing. Whether they actually result in healing depends on how we ultimately respond to them. I'm referring to climate change and a shift to the new global world order. The former is, I'm sure, familiar to everyone. I'm not so certain about the latter. With respect to climate change, I would argue that humanity's collective response actually response to both could lead to either civilizational healing or collapse. But with respect to climate change, I want you to know that my opinion is that this is not about saving the earth. The earth will transform in ways that ensure that the conditions for life prevail with or without humans. That's true of her response to both climate change and the geopolitical evolution of the new world order. There are no guarantees for the future of humanity. We have backed ourselves into a proverbial corner, and the options for success, our success, are reduced with each day that passes without appropriate constructive actions. In either case, transformation leading to healing will depend on heightened degrees of cooperation at every level, global to local, period. Einstein reminded us that God/nature is subtle, but not malicious. A confluence of events that seem dire may be just what the doctor ordered to bring about the healing that we so desperately need. To paraphrase another hero of mine, the comic strip political possum Pogo, we seem to be faced with insurmountable opportunities. I'm currently involved in an effort to revise and resurrect what may be viewed as either a very subversive or a very naive concept, the World Game Workshop. Originally conceived and introduced by design scientist R. Buckminster Fuller, World Game Workshop is an interactive global simulation. It's designed to create a non-threatening environment wherein participants and players self-discover the multiple synergetic benefits of cooperation. They do this by role-playing as nation states or groups of nations, and that cooperatively respond to real-time data scenarios, focusing on world resources, human needs, and technologies, pursuant to making the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological damage or disadvantage to anyone. That's why I said it's either subversive or naive. The World Game participants and I happen to think it's very subversive and very doable. The World Game places participants in charge of the world and helps them understand in practical terms how to think globally and act locally. In today's tightly interconnected world, we cannot afford to say that we don't have time to be concerned with world affairs. The challenge is to focus on those global issues with the potential to directly or indirectly impact our local plans and effort. What does the game reveal about our options for climate change and our options for healing the earth? Let's do a quick hypothetical, hopefully not for much longer, scenario in which the Joe Biden administration rejoins the international climate change discussions and launches a version of the Green New Deal, pledging to meet agreed upon greenhouse gas emission goals. Full of good intentions and political will, he encounters the reality that Netherlands officials recently discovered. That is, that they don't have enough resources to build the solar panels or wind turbines necessary to achieve their goals. The reality is that efforts to meet goals based on every country going it alone cannot succeed. There simply is not enough resources to support such an approach. The more viable and perhaps only alternative is to cooperate and construct an integrated world grid. Such a plan was first proposed by Fuller in the 1970s and is now being advanced by China, called the Global Energy Interconnection. It would not only optimize the use of resources, but would also pave the way for renewables to completely decarbonize the electric grid and the transportation sector. We must establish new geopolitical ecosystems that generate political versions of regenerative cascades like the Yellowstone Park that lead to new and powerful systems integrities. In this scenario, cooperation becomes the new globalization. God, nature is subtle but not malicious. A few quick observations about the emerging New World Order and healing before bringing this down to the local level. In April 1955, a landmark event took place in Bandung, Indonesia. 29 Asian and African states, most of which were newly independent, came together to discuss peace and the role of the Third World in the Cold War, economic development, and decolonization. Never before had leaders from so many non-Western countries gathered together to make common cause. This was the beginning of a healing process that continues to this day. My guess is that most of you never heard of Bandung. I didn't until recently, the Bandung Gathering, that is, but it is manifest today in Eurasia's challenge to the dominant Western-centric narrative and influence in world affairs. It is behind China's attempts, among other things, at transformation and healing to shape a new world order that reflects and honors other perspectives along with those of the West. And it's important to really consider a country like China, regardless of how you feel about it, that refers to its century of humiliation. And when you think about the process of healing and transformation, I won't have time to go into detail of that, but it's important to keep that in mind. So I have purposely taken the long path to bringing the topic of transformation and healing home to Massachusetts so as to place things within the context of a new global narrative. From 1995 to 1999, I witnessed and was fortunate to be able to play a small role in the truly inspiring transformation/healing process of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, a marginalized Boston community of African-American, Cape Verdean, Latino, and white residents. At first blush, it would appear to be as far removed from the trophic cascading Yellowstone Park as one can imagine. But upon closer examination, The Death and Life of Dudley, A Lesson of Urban Economics was the title of the April 8, 1990 Boston Globe magazine cover story. I quote, "Shay Madyon moved to the Dudley neighborhood 14 years ago. The first 3 years I was here on Dudley Street," she says, "I used to hear fire engines every night. The fire engines thundered by regularly in the 1970s to aim their hoses at the burning houses and stores, then standing on what is now a loose chain of vacant lots. By then, most of the Irish and Italian residents of this part of the city had left for the suburbs, and many of them facilitated, in many cases, by the GI Bill, which was not accessible by many of those who remained in the neighborhood and who also served in the Great War. Taking with them, that is the Irish and Italian former residents, the attention of most banks and businesses. Buildings were abandoned, eventually condemned, torn down one by one. Some owners, rather than pay taxes on deteriorating buildings, cashed in on insurance by having them set afire. And by the time those fires stopped, there were no fewer than 1,300 vacant lots, covering more than 20% of the neighborhood. The transformation of the Dudley neighborhood from that described in the Boston Globe article into a vibrant urban village employed a variety of creative approaches to neighborhood revitalization, including what I call radical civics and civil anarchy. By that, I mean the residents chose to work with, but not be led by institutions like the City of Boston and local philanthropies. They created a community-based planning entity. That is the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, otherwise known as DSNI. DSNI organized residents to define the boundaries of their neighborhood. They defined the boundaries of their neighborhood, and these boundaries transcended official city census tracts. Aligning themselves with lawyers and sympathetic planners and architects, they developed their own comprehensive plan for revitalization. They also educated themselves on the topic of city power. What are cities capable of doing legally and politically that residents aren't aware of and city officials prefer that they don't know about? They brought their plan to the mayor of Boston and demanded control over the neighborhood's abandoned vacant properties. Mayor Ray Flynn acquiesced. He had just come out of a contentious mayoral race against Mel King, the first Black mayoral candidate in Boston. We're in the midst of, the city was in the midst of court-ordered busing to integrate the schools in Boston. And Mayor Flynn, I think, realized that he needed to build back trust and support of the Black community. With his actions, the Dudley Street neighborhood became the first and only grassroots community-based group to be granted the power of eminent domain over all vacant abandoned land within their self-described boundaries. That land was placed in a community land trust and was overseen by an elected board of directors, all residents. They filled the vacant parcels with beautiful, affordable housing that has remained affordable thanks to the community land trust, thus avoiding the seemingly unavoidable scenario of gentrification leading to displacement. The community gained considerable power that I can attest was never abused. In fact, they even debated many days as to whether or not they should accept the power of eminent domain. While there is still much that needs to be done, the Dudley residents exude a palpable sense of pride that suggests that the physical transformation has been accomplished by a healing process that is inspiring, even as it too still has a way to go before the wounds have completely healed. In the World Game Workshop Systems Lexicon, trim tabs are points of leverage in a system where appropriate and relatively small design intervention can result in major change, i.e. the 31 some odd wolves that changed the course of rivers in Yellowstone Park. The wolves were the trim tabs of Yellowstone Park transformational healing process. There's little question that gaining access to the land provided Dudley neighborhood residents with considerable leverage. The Yellowstone example is clearly replicable. While the results of Dudley's experience are extraordinary, so too were the means by which they were able to acquire the land. Few communities are likely to be granted the power of eminent domain by their cities. Does that mean that the Dudley model is not replicable? No, it means that alternative strategies for land acquisition must be discovered or developed. Hopefully the DSNI experience will provide the impetus and inspiration to pursue such alternatives. I learned of one possibility from George Monbiot during the most recent Schumacher lecture. Concepts like communities' right of first refusal to purchase vacant and derelict land within their boundaries, and funding mechanisms like a community land fund to help purchase them are among those. That's radical civics. I wish you all success in your efforts to transform and heal. Thank you.